Metropolis in Halo 2 concludes with what is perhaps the game's most memorable set piece, as you jump onto a Scarab and then continue to fight the Covenant while on board. But is the level actually any good, or is its thunderous climax merely part of a facade which masks an altogether less exciting experience? That's a question I hope will be in a good position to answer by the time we reach the end of this video. Here's what happened previously on Halo 2 prior to the beginning of Metropolis. After Installation 04 is completely destroyed following the events of Halo Combat Evolved, the Covenant's leaders, the Prophets, brand Thelvadam, the elite blamed for the disaster, with the mark of shame as punishment. In stark contrast, Master Chief fares far better aboard Cairo Station as he collects a new set of armour, links up with Sergeant Johnson and heads to an awards ceremony, also attended by Captain Keyes' daughter Miranda, before the celebration comes to an abrupt end as the Covenant launches an attack on Earth. Defending the station and using one of the Covenant's own bombs to lay waste to part of the enemy's armada, Chief heads to Earth to continue the fight before his Pelican is shot down by a nearby Scarab. He then battles his way through the streets of Old Mombasa and eventually reaches the bridge leading to New Mombasa, where the Prophet of Regret ship is located, and that is the point where we'll jump into things proper. Opening on scenes of the Scarab, which popped up multiple times throughout previous mission outskirts, which you can watch my video about by clicking the card on screen now, Chief catches up with Johnson, and it's worth noting some of his dialogue will actually change depending on what difficulty you've chosen. I won't play all 4 versions, but as an example, here's a line on normal.
The Chief is gonna jump in this tank, roll across the bridge, and blow up any inhuman son of a bitch dumb enough to get between him and the Prophet of Regret. Pull yourself together, because you're going with it.
And here's that same line on Legendary.
Usually the good Lord works in mysterious ways, but not today. This here is 66 tons of straight up HE spewing divine intervention. If God is love, then you can call me Cupid.
Difficulty aside, we also cannot forget about him uttering one of the series' most famous lines.
Thanks for the tank. He never gets me anything.
Oh, I know what the ladies like.
The changes depending on difficulty don't stop there either, it extends to the first chapter's name as well. On Easy and Normal, it's named Ladies Like Armour Plating, on Heroic, it's Ladies Like Grinding Treads, and finally on Legendary, it's Ladies Like Superior Firepower. The Scorpion run which follows is quite basic in its setup, but is all the more entertaining because of it. Unless you're playing on Legendary, you really don't have to do much more than drive in a straight line, blowing up enemy vehicles which head in your direction at regular intervals, while listening to a fantastic variation of Halo's theme, and sometimes that's all that's needed. There are very few Halo levels which begin immediately with a vehicle section, you can count them on one hand in fact, which makes Metropolis something of an anomaly. It also makes perfect sense when considering the mission's context. Metropolis and Outskirts before it were likely meant to be a single experience, and prior to hopping in the tank, you would have just spent a good while grinding your way through the tunnel at the end of Outskirts. If the levels weren't separated, you'd finish the tunnel, a fairly tough, narrow experience which forces you to play a tad more defensively, and then head across the bridge in the Scorpion, again a narrow affair, but one which encourages you to go on the offensive. Divided by loading screens and a cinematic, the similarities and differences between them aren't necessarily apparent, but they're definitely there. This section is really about beginning the second half of what should have been a single mission with a bang, picking up the pace and handing back power to you after a first half where you're often on the back foot. I also like to think of this segment as the progenitor for much of Halo 3 ODST's Coastal Highway. They both take place just outside New Mombasa and are fairly similar in terms of design, although unsurprisingly ODST's rendition is far more involved thanks to the extra power afforded to Bungie by the Xbox 360. I always enjoy playing the pair one after the other to marvel at how far the series evolved over time. It's easy to forget how much more complex it became across console generations. Reaching the other side of the bridge, you're met by Banshees.
That's quite a welcome party.
As well as a few Wraiths. When the encounter with them is done and dusted, you then enter a tunnel very much in the mould of that featured at the end of Outskirts. I get why it's there. I'd imagine it gave the Xbox time to load out the previous area, a very expansive environment, and begin to load in the rest of the level, and it also adds consistency. Logically, both sides of the bridge would have had similar tunnels leading to them. However, it's also not very exciting and could have been cut entirely given how long you spend in a more interesting, albeit overly lengthy tunnel at the end of Outskirts. I wonder if it was in part included to help bulk out Metropolis's runtime too. Viewed as a singular entity, and ignoring what I said earlier about how it was probably meant to be part of something larger, I find its pace quite jarring. It has some excellent moments, such as the Scorpion run at its beginning and the Scarab Set Piece at its end, but equally, it often feels as if a lot of its sections finish just as they're really getting going. To put it another way, there's sometimes not quite enough to get your teeth into. I've always thought of Metropolis as being superior to its sibling Outskirts, but the more I played them recently, the less sure I became of that, to the point there is a world where, depending on my mood, I might even rank Outskirts higher. Metropolis keeps an incredibly quick pace, which, in fairness, can also be said of Outskirts, but where in the former I usually come away from its different segments feeling like there should have been a bit more to them, in the latter they're about the perfect length and generally feel more well-rounded as a result. In terms of spectacle, Metropolis is undoubtedly king, but from a gameplay perspective, I'd argue that Outskirts is the more involved of the two. There's a bit of bread and butter encounter design Bungie throws in when you reach the open area after the tunnel in the form of a single jackal equipped with a beam rifle. He's there so you can easily whack him on the back, nick his weapon, and be properly equipped for the long-range combat you'll then likely indulge in. It's a trick you may have noticed Bungie using multiple times during Halo 2, for example in similar circumstances towards the end of Delta Halo. Once the immediate area has been cleared, or perhaps even earlier, you'll hopefully find yourself in the gunner seat of a brand new type of Warthog for the first time ever in the series. Its cannon is an awesome weapon which tears through the Covenant with ease, and although the driver AI is usually pretty decent, it does still struggle every now and then. Though even with that being the case, it's still a million times better than Cat's in Reach. All in all, it's an entertaining, if unremarkable section, aside from the introduction of the new vehicle, of course, which gives you a decent number of options in areas large enough to make most strategies viable, even if choosing the straightforward option of simply making everything explode is by far the most appealing. Finding yourself back on the streets of New Mombasa, Metropolis begins to build up to its big finale.
There are a number of Marines trapped in that building, Chief. Concentrate on the raids, they're the biggest threat.
In my video covering Outskirts, I touched on my disappointment that Halo's first ever levels set on Earth never really come close to matching the game's E3 2003 gameplay trailer. The Warthog sequence in Metropolis, however, is the exception that perhaps proves the rule. If you remember the trailer at all, there's a part towards its end during which Chief takes to a Warthog's cannon while being driven through the city. There's even a couple of Covenant shadows featured, which, come to think of it, is probably where the idea of including them in Outskirts' tunnel section came from. As you speed down the road in Metropolis, the cracking track Earth City kicks in, allies arrive to lend a helping hand, and plenty of Covenant also make their presence known. And it truly feels, if only for a minute or two, like you're almost playing a sequence taken straight from that amazing trailer, even if it's not quite on the same scale. It's proof for me that Bungie were no doubt capable of pulling off most, if not all, of what was shown in the trailer, and I'd love to one day learn more about whether much of what's in it didn't make the cut due to technical limitations, a lack of time, or for a completely different reason. Leaving the streets and joining the Marines hunkered down in a nearby building, you make your way to a vantage point where this scene plays out.
When I asked for reinforcements, I didn't think they'd send a Spartan. We got trouble.
See this look? It's terror!
I love that the Marine talks about how great it is to have a Spartan right before you're given front row seats to the Scarab absolutely decimating a Scorpion. As the Marine alludes to, you are a Spartan, and Spartans are pretty deadly, but you're also quickly reminded of what a huge threat the Scarab poses as well, to stop you getting too cocky. Having watched the Scarab lay waste to your allies across 2 levels, at long last it's time to get some revenge. This is one of those occasions where considering context when looking at part of a game is incredibly important. Playing through Metropolis's Scarab set piece in the present and comparing it to the vastly expanded equivalents featured in Halo 3, the Covenant in particular, it doesn't offer a whole lot. You essentially just jump onto a platform that functions similar to many other areas encounters in Halo 2 take place in, except it's a bit bumpier. You clear out the Covenant standing in your way, maybe even choosing to thin their ranks somewhat before you board the Scarab itself, and then run to its controls, at which point the mission ends without you having to do anything else. In Halo 3, Scarabs introduce an entirely new gameplay proposition that fundamentally alters the way you play the game. In Halo 2, the Scarab functions as little more than set dressing while you do the same thing you've already been doing. It's not aged well, there can be no denying that, but man alive, was it also extraordinarily exciting to play through in 2004. Back then, there was nothing quite like it, and finally being given the opportunity to destroy such a formidable foe was exhilarating. And that's why, when it comes to this part of Metropolis, it is one of those you had to be there moments. If you played Halo 2 for the first time in the present, it's not going to stand out as anything overly exciting, but if you played Halo 2 nearly 20 years ago, around the time of its release, you'll remember it as one of the standout parts of the game's campaign. As the Scarab crumbles and Master Chief walks away from the wreckage, a scene which is a personal favourite of mine, Metropolis concludes with Chief and Sergeant Johnson docking within amber clad to join Miranda Keyes in pursuit of the Prophets of Regret.
Ma'am, without a destination solution.
We are not losing that ship.
Metropolis is a funny old level, as it's one that was quite spectacular in 2004, but has in places also aged pretty poorly compared to some other missions featured in Halo 2. There are parts of it which definitely left their mark back in the day, which have since lost some of their impact, having been superseded by better examples in later entries, such as the bridge sequence at its start and the Scarab set piece at its end. With them making up a substantial part of the experience, Metropolis struggles at times in the present to recapture the magic that once made it so enthralling, but equally we must also view it in the context of Halo 2's release. When examining it from that perspective, I think it's fair to say that it was one of the campaign's most memorable sections, a thrilling battle through the city of New Mombasa which brought a whole new sense of scale to the franchise. Thanks for watching the video, boys, girls and Spartans. If you had a Scarab-tacular time, do think about liking, subscribing and letting me know your thoughts, and fingers crossed we'll meet again soon.